She stood there again. Same time, same place, same hope dying a little more each day. Catherine Kane watched her 247th sunset from that weathered porch in El Dorado Canyon, Nevada, and still no sign of Thomas. 2 years, 8 months, and 12 days since he'd kissed her goodbye, since he'd promised to return with enough gold to secure their future, since he'd made her believe she was the center of his world. The town called her poor Miss Kane now. 26 years old and still waiting like a ghost frozen in time while life moved on around her. But what they didn't know, what Catherine herself didn't know yet, was that the man she waited for had never intended to come back at all. And the stranger who just rode into town, he was about to shatter every truth she'd built her life around. The general store bell chimed as Catherine pushed through, her shopping list crumpled in her fist. Flour, sugar, coffee, the basics. The same items she'd been buying alone for nearly 3 years. "Evening, Miss Catherine," Mrs. Powell chirped with that practiced sympathy that made Catherine's skin crawl. "Any word from Mr. Daniels?" Catherine's jaw tightened. "No word, Mrs. Powell. Nearly 3 years now, isn't it?" 2 years, 8 months, and 12 days. The precision was automatic now, like counting prison time. Mrs. Powell's lips pursed in that infuriating way that said, "Poor thing," without speaking the words. But before she could respond, the bell rang again. The man who entered had to duck through the doorframe. Trail dust covered him head to boot, and a scraggly beard obscured half his face, but his eyes, sharp green against sun-darkened skin, locked onto Catherine with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Afternoon," he said, removing his hat. "Name's Adam Fletcher." Catherine nodded curtly, suddenly eager to leave. Something about this stranger unsettled her. Not danger, exactly. Something worse. Recognition. As if he knew something about her she didn't know herself. She gathered her purchases quickly, but as she moved toward the door, Fletcher stepped aside, not quite far enough. Their shoulders brushed. His hand steadied her elbow. "Pardon me, miss," he murmured. Catherine fled into the fading daylight, but she felt his eyes on her back. When she glanced over her shoulder, Fletcher stood in the doorway watching her, his expression unreadable. She quickened her pace, heart hammering for reasons she couldn't name. Behind her, Adam Fletcher touched his hat brim in a gesture that could have been respect, or could have been something else entirely. Because Fletcher knew exactly who Catherine Kane was. And he knew the truth about Thomas Daniels. The question was, would the truth destroy her, or finally set her free? Sheriff Willis appeared at Catherine's gate the next morning before sunrise, his weathered face grim. "Morning, Miss Kane. Got a situation." Catherine's stomach dropped. "Thomas?" "Not exactly." The sheriff shifted in his saddle. "Thomas Daniels' brother has arrived. Says his name is Matthew. Came looking for Thomas." The world tilted slightly. "His brother. Figured you'd want warning before he calls on you this afternoon." Willis paused. "There's something else. That new fellow, Fletcher, he's asking questions about the Daniels claim. Might be nothing, but..." "What sort of questions?" "Location, mostly. Says he's a prospector himself." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Just keep your wits about you, Miss Kane." After he left, Catherine stood frozen in her garden, mind racing. Thomas had mentioned a brother once or twice, older, living back east, but he'd never visited, never even written, as far as Catherine knew. Why now? Why after all this time? She rushed inside to change into her best dress, hands trembling as she pinned her hair. This was Thomas's brother. Perhaps he brought news. Perhaps he knew where Thomas had gone. Perhaps... The knock came earlier than expected. Catherine opened the door to find a man who was unmistakably related to Thomas. Same broad shoulders, same square jaw, But where Thomas's eyes had been warm, Matthew's were cold as January river ice. "Miss Kane?" He didn't smile. "May I come in?" Something was wrong. Catherine felt it in her bones as she stepped aside. Matthew Daniels settled into her parlor like a predator claiming territory, his gaze cataloging every detail of her modest home. "Sheriff Willis mentioned you were looking for Thomas," Catherine began. "I've been trying to locate him for some time." Matthew's voice was flat. "Our mother passed last year. There are matters of inheritance. I'm sorry for your loss. I've been to 3 mining camps and 2 towns before this one." His eyes bored into hers. "No one's seen him in nearly 3 years." Catherine's hands clenched in her lap. "He left here 2 years and 8 months ago. He said he'd found a promising claim. And you've had no word since." "It wasn't a question. Nothing. Miss Kane, I don't wish to be indelicate, but what exactly was your relationship with my brother?" The words stung. "We were engaged to be married. Thomas gave me this house as a promise while he worked to build our future." Matthew glanced around again, and Catherine suddenly saw her home through his eyes. Small, simple, hardly the gift of a man flush with gold. "And the mining claim," Matthew pressed. "Where was it?" "He never told me exactly. Said it was better I didn't know, in case word got out." Now the words sounded foolish, naive. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Miss Kane, I believe we must face facts. My brother has disappeared without a trace for nearly 3 years. Either something happened to him." Matthew held up a hand as Catherine started to protest. "Or he chose not to return." "He wouldn't—" Another knock interrupted them. Catherine opened the door to find Adam Fletcher on her porch, hat already in hand. "Miss Kane," he said, "I hope I'm not intruding." Before she could respond, Matthew was at her shoulder. "It's all right. I should be going anyway." He extended his hand to Fletcher. "Matthew Daniels." Fletcher's eyebrows rose. "Adam Fletcher. Daniels, you said. Any relation to Thomas Daniels?" "My brother. You knew him." "We crossed paths briefly at a strike about 30 miles north of here." Fletcher glanced at Catherine. "That's actually why I came to speak with Miss Kane. I heard in town she might know where to find him." Catherine's heart stuttered. "When did you see him?" "Nearly 3 years ago now. Summer of '73. Hope died before it could fully kindle." Matthew was studying Fletcher with undisguised suspicion. "You're a prospector too?" "Among other things. Done some ranching, some scouting." Fletcher's voice was easy, but his eyes remained sharp. "Whatever pays." After Matthew left with promises to return, Catherine found herself alone with Fletcher, uncertain why he'd remained. "Mr. Fletcher, if you're looking for Thomas, I'm afraid I can't help you." "So I've heard." He seemed to hesitate. "Miss Kane, may I speak frankly?" "I suppose." "I've been asking around town about Thomas Daniels and his claim. What I'm hearing doesn't match up with what I know." Catherine frowned. "What do you mean?" Fletcher's green eyes held hers steadily. "Folks say he left to register a claim he'd found, but the night I met him, he lost heavily at cards. Told everyone who'd listen that he'd been working a played-out hole for months, with nothing to show for it." The room spun. "That's not possible. Thomas told me—" "People sometimes say what others want to hear, Miss Kane, especially when they're in trouble." "Are you suggesting Thomas lied to me?" Her voice rose. "I'm suggesting the situation might be more complicated than you know." Fletcher leaned forward. "Your Thomas was in debt that night. Bad debt to men you don't want to owe. The kind of men who might come looking eventually." Catherine's mouth went dry. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Matthew Daniels isn't just here about his brother." Fletcher's voice dropped. "He's here about the claim. A claim that, from what I can piece together, doesn't exist. How would you know that? Because I've spent 2 years tracking down every registered claim within 50 miles of here, and none of them belong to Thomas Daniels. Catherine stood abruptly. I think you should leave. Fletcher rose but didn't move toward the door. Instead, he pulled a folded paper from his pocket and set it on the side table. If you change your mind about talking, I'm staying at the Silver Dollar, room 6. After he left, Catherine sank into her chair, trembling. She wanted to dismiss Fletcher's words as lies, but a small voice whispered truths she'd been suppressing for months. Thomas had been evasive about the claim's location, increasingly anxious in the weeks before he left. And there had been that night he'd come home late, smelling of whiskey, with a bruise on his jaw he'd claimed came from a fall. Catherine shook her head, trying to clear it. No. Thomas had loved her. He had promised. But as she looked around the small house, the house that was supposed to be just the beginning, she wondered for the first time if the life she'd been waiting to resume had ever truly existed at all. Or if she'd been waiting for a ghost who was about to become very, very real. The knock came at midnight. Catherine jerked awake in her bed, heart pounding. The spring storm that had blown in rattled her windows, and through the wind and rain she heard it again. Sharp knocking, deliberate. She lit her lamp with shaking hands and padded to the front door in her nightgown and robe. Who's there? Fletcher, I need to speak with you. It's urgent. Against every rule of propriety, Catherine unlatched the door. Fletcher stumbled inside, soaked from the rain, water dripping from his hat onto her floor. But it was the bandage on his forearm, blood seeping through the fabric, that made Catherine gasp. What happened? Matthew Daniels broke into my room tonight, held a gun on me and demanded to know what I'd done with his share. His share of what? The money from the El Dorado Star scheme. The room tilted. What scheme? Fletcher met her eyes, and in them Catherine saw pity mixed with determination. Catherine, Thomas wasn't just in debt when he disappeared. He was selling fraudulent mining shares to investors back east, shares in a mine that doesn't exist. That's impossible. I'm afraid it isn't. Fletcher pushed up his sleeve, revealing the knife wound. Matthew decided to encourage me to be more forthcoming. He believes you're the key, that Thomas must have told you something, left you some clue to where the money is hidden. I don't know anything about any money. I believe you, Fletcher said, but Matthew doesn't, and he made it clear that his patience is running out. Catherine's mind spun. Why are you really here, Mr. Fletcher? Because I was one of the investors. The admission hung between them. I put $500, my entire savings, into the El Dorado Star. Money I'd earned through years of honest work. So you're here for revenge. Justice, Fletcher corrected. And to recover what was stolen, if possible. He hesitated. I didn't expect to find you, though. A woman still waiting faithfully for a man who never intended to return. Catherine sank into the nearest chair. I think you should go. Not until you're safe. Fletcher's voice was firm. Matthew is dangerous, Catherine, and I won't leave you alone to face him. I don't even know if I can believe you. Then believe this. Fletcher reached into his coat and pulled out a crumpled wanted poster. He smoothed it on the table. Catherine's breath caught. Thomas's face stared up at her from the paper, and beneath his likeness, the words, wanted for fraud and theft. The description included the scar on his left hand, a jagged line across his palm from a mining accident, a scar Catherine had traced with her own fingers. This could be any Thomas Daniels, she whispered, but the protest was hollow. The description matches, Fletcher said gently. I'm sorry, Catherine. I truly am. She stared at the poster, watching her entire past 3 years crumble to dust. The waiting, the faith, the love, all of it built on lies. But the night was about to get much, much worse. Because outside in the storm, Matthew Daniels was coming, and he wasn't planning to leave without answers. The sharp knock made them both freeze. "Miss Kane," Matthew's voice carried through the door. "I know you're awake, and I know Fletcher is in there with you. Open the door, or I'll be forced to break it down." Fletcher quickly gathered the papers, thrusting them into Catherine's hands. "Is there a back way out?" She nodded, numb. "Go to the sheriff. Tell him everything." Fletcher pressed the portfolio and the gold pouch into her trembling fingers. "I'll deal with Daniels. But he's armed. He hurt you once already. I can handle myself." Fletcher guided her toward the kitchen. "Just go. Quickly." Catherine hesitated, torn between fear and something else, something that felt dangerously close to caring for this stranger who'd upended her world. "Be careful," she whispered. Then she slipped through the darkened kitchen and out into the storm. The rain hit her like a wall, immediately soaking through her nightgown and robe. Wind tore at her hair, pulling it loose from its pins. But Catherine clutched the evidence to her chest and ran. Behind her, she heard the front door open. Matthew's voice tight with anger. "Where is she, Fletcher?" "Gone, and so is the evidence of what you and Thomas did." Catherine didn't wait to hear more. She splashed through puddles forming on the dirt road, her bare feet bruised by stones, her lungs burning. The sheriff's office was at the far end of town, a 10-minute walk in good weather. In this storm, it might as well have been miles. She had gone perhaps 100 yards when she heard the shout behind her. Glancing back, Catherine saw a bulky figure emerge from her house. Matthew. And he was coming fast. Fear gave her new energy. Catherine broke into a full run, no longer caring about the mud splashing her nightgown or the sharp rocks cutting her feet. The portfolio's papers fluttered in her grip as wind tried to tear them away. The main street was deserted, windows dark. But ahead, blessed sight, the sheriff's office glowed with lamplight. She was within sight of salvation when her foot caught on a loose board. Catherine sprawled forward, the portfolio flying from her grasp. Papers scattered across the wet boardwalk, instantly soaked. The gold pouch rolled away into shadow. No! She scrambled to gather them, hands slipping on wet documents. A boot came down on the deed to the California property, pinning it. Catherine looked up into Matthew Daniels's face, contorted with rage. "Did you really think you could outrun me?" he snarled, yanking her to her feet by her arm. His grip was iron. Catherine struggled, but he was twice her size and fueled by desperation. "Let go of me." "Not until you tell me what you and Fletcher have done with my money." "It's not your money. It was stolen from innocent people." Matthew's laugh was harsh. "Fletcher, innocent." He shook his head. "You are more naive than I thought, Miss Kane. Adam Fletcher is no victim. He's a U.S. Marshal who's been hunting Thomas for over a year." The ground dropped away beneath Catherine's feet. "A Marshal? Oh, he didn't tell you that part." Matthew's smile was cruel. "Interesting." Before Catherine could process this new betrayal, another voice cut through the storm. "Let her go, Daniels." Fletcher stood yards away, gun drawn, and pointed directly at Matthew. Rain streamed down his face, but his hand was steady. "Marshal Fletcher," Matthew acknowledged, not loosening his grip. "I was just telling Miss Kane about your true profession." "I was getting to that." Fletcher's voice was level. "Now let her go and step away from those papers." Instead, Matthew pulled Catherine closer, using her as a shield. From his coat he produced his own revolver, pressing it to Catherine's temple. "Back off, Marshal, or Miss Kane won't live to see morning." The cold metal against her skin focused Catherine's mind with terrifying clarity. She was going to die here, on this rain-soaked boardwalk, because she'd been foolish enough to wait for a man who'd never loved her. Foolish enough to trust another who'd lied about who he was. "You don't want to do this," Fletcher said, but Catherine heard the edge in his voice now. Real fear. Threatening her life will only make things worse. Things can't get much worse. Matthew's breath was hot against Catherine's ear. "Now drop your weapon. Slowly." Fletcher hesitated. His eyes met Catherine's, asking a question. Somehow she understood. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. "All right," Fletcher said, bending to place his gun on the wet boardwalk. "Just stay calm." As he straightened, Catherine made her move. She drove her elbow backward with every ounce of strength, straight into Matthew's stomach. The blow doubled him over. His grip loosened. Catherine tore free and lunged sideways just as his gun discharged with a crack lost in thunder. Fletcher sprang forward. The men collided, grappling for control of Matthew's revolver. "Catherine, run!" Fletcher shouted as they struggled. But Catherine didn't run. She scrambled for Fletcher's dropped gun instead, her hands shaking as she lifted the heavy weapon. She'd never held a firearm before. Didn't know if she could use it. Prayed she wouldn't have to. "Fletcher!" she called. Both men looked up. Matthew's eyes widened at the sight of the gun in her hands. In that moment of distraction, Fletcher landed a solid blow to his jaw. Matthew's head snapped back. Fletcher wrenched the revolver from his grasp and pressed it to his chest. "Don't move." Light spilled onto the scene as the sheriff's office door burst open. "What in tarnation is going on out here?" Sheriff Willis demanded, his own gun drawn. Fletcher didn't take his eyes off Matthew. "Marshal Adam Fletcher, U.S. Marshal Service. This man is Matthew Daniels, wanted in connection with a fraud scheme that stole thousands from investors across 3 territories." The sheriff squinted through rain. "Got any proof of these claims?" "In my left breast pocket. My credentials. And Miss Kane has documentation." After examining Fletcher's badge, the sheriff nodded. "Seems in order. Miss Kane, why don't you come inside? And perhaps put that gun down before someone gets hurt." Catherine realized she was still clutching the weapon. She lowered it carefully, her whole body shaking from cold and reaction. "Sheriff," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Everything Marshal Fletcher has said is true. Matthew Daniels threatened me tonight. And his brother, the man I was waiting for, he was never coming back at all." As they filed into the warm, dry office, Catherine felt something shift inside her. The waiting was over. The truth, painful as it was, had finally arrived. And the stranger who'd brought it, he wasn't a stranger at all. He was the first honest man she'd met in 3 years. But the truth about Thomas Daniels was still waiting in California. And before this was over, Catherine would have to face him one last time. Morning light filtered through the sheriff's office window as Catherine finished her statement. She'd told them everything. The waiting, the promises, the small signs she'd ignored. Fletcher had remained nearby throughout, his presence somehow steadying despite the revelation of his deception about his identity. "I should have told you I was a marshal from the start," he said when they were finally alone, his green eyes serious. "But I needed to understand the situation first, needed to know if you were involved. And now I know you're as much a victim as anyone Thomas Daniels defrauded." Fletcher leaned forward. "Catherine, this isn't over. We still need to find Thomas and recover the money. And I think you might be the key." "How?" "I don't know anything. Not consciously, perhaps. But think back. Did Thomas ever give you anything? Even something small?" Catherine frowned, then remembered. "Gold flakes. The morning he left, he gave me a small bag. Said they were the first fruits of our future. Fletcher's eyes sharpened. Where are they now? Hidden, in my mother's old Bible. Show me. Back at her house, Catherine retrieved the Bible from her bookshelf. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it to Psalms, where she'd hollowed out a space in the pages. The small cloth pouch nestled inside. Fletcher examined the gold flakes carefully, rubbing them between his fingers. His expression changed. These aren't from any claim around here. How can you tell? The color, the texture. I've worked enough mines to recognize regional differences. Fletcher looked up, excitement bright in his eyes. This gold is from California, not Nevada. That doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense. It's a clue. Fletcher stood. Did Thomas have any maps, papers, anything about California? Catherine led him to the spare room where Thomas's trunk sat untouched, gathering dust. Opening it felt like exhuming a grave, the grave of the life she'd thought they'd share. Near the bottom, they found a leather portfolio, and inside it, a deed. Not to property in El Dorado Canyon, but to a parcel of land in Coloma, California. Purchased 2 years ago, just months before Thomas disappeared. Coloma, Fletcher breathed. Where gold was first discovered in California, where the whole rush began. He looked at Catherine with new intensity. That's where he went. That's where he hid the money. So he's alive. The words felt strange. For months, Catherine had feared Thomas was dead. Now she almost wished he were. It would have been kinder than this calculated abandonment. Was alive 3 months ago anyway. I received reports he was seen there recently. Fletcher's jaw tightened. Catherine, I have to go to California, and I need you to come with me. Me. Why? To identify him. To ensure we have the right man. Fletcher took her hands. But also because you deserve to face him, to hear the truth from his own mouth. You've spent nearly 3 years waiting. You deserve closure. Catherine looked around the small house that had been both prison and sanctuary, the porch where she'd stood every evening, the life she'd put on hold. Fletcher was right. She deserved answers. When do we leave? His smile was like sunrise after the storm. This afternoon, if you can be ready. I'll be ready. Because Catherine Kane was done waiting. It was time to chase the truth, even if it destroyed her. The journey to Coloma took days of jarring stagecoaches and dusty roads over the Sierra Nevada mountains. Throughout it all, Fletcher proved himself a considerate companion, respectful, attentive, and gradually revealing his own story. He'd grown up on a Colorado ranch, worked as a cowhand and prospector before joining the Marshals. His investment in Thomas's fraudulent scheme had represented his dream of buying a small ranch of his own someday. I should have known better, he said one evening, as they watched the sunset paint the mountains gold. Men who promise easy riches are usually selling nothing but air. We believe what we want to believe, Catherine replied, thinking of her own willful blindness. Hope is a powerful thing. So is resilience. Fletcher's voice softened. You're stronger than you know, Catherine. Those quiet moments of connection punctuated their purposeful journey. And with each mile, Catherine felt herself changing. The woman who'd waited on that porch was dying. Someone new was emerging, someone who moved forward instead of standing still. They arrived in Coloma on a golden afternoon. The mining town bustled with activity, larger than El Dorado Canyon, but bearing the same marks of gold fever and desperate dreams. We'll get rooms first, Fletcher decided, then make discreet inquiries. But inquiries proved unnecessary, because that evening, as they entered the Nugget Saloon, Catherine ignoring the scandalous impropriety, she saw him. Thomas Daniels sat at a corner table, golden hair longer than she remembered, expensive suit marking him as a man of means. He was laughing at something, raising a whiskey glass in a toast. Living well on money stolen from people like Fletcher. Living the life he'd promised her they'd share. "That's him," Catherine whispered. Fletcher's expression hardened. "Stay here. Let me approach him first." Catherine watched as Fletcher made his way through the crowd. She saw Thomas look up, polite inquiry on his face, saw Fletcher produce his Marshal's badge, saw the color drain from Thomas's face as realization hit. Then Thomas laughed, a harsh, desperate sound, and said something to Fletcher. Catherine couldn't wait any longer. She crossed the room on steady feet, no longer the waiting woman, but someone new, someone who demanded truth. Thomas saw her coming. His reaction was everything she'd imagined in her angriest moments. Slack-jawed shock, his hand frozen mid-reach for his glass. "Hello, Thomas," she said, her voice steady as stone. "Catherine." He breathed her name like a curse. "What are you doing here?" "She's helping the U.S. Marshal Service bring you to justice," Fletcher said calmly. "Thomas Daniels, you're under arrest for fraud, theft, and conspiracy." Thomas couldn't tear his eyes from Catherine. "You've been waiting all this time, haven't you? On that porch." The question cut deeper than any knife could. Even now, knowing everything, Thomas expected her loyalty, her faith, her eternal patience. "I did wait," Catherine acknowledged. "For 2 years and 8 months. But I'm not waiting anymore, Thomas." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, calculation forming behind his eyes, the look he'd worn when talking his way out of trouble. "Catherine, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I can explain everything." He cast a disparaging glance at Fletcher. "Whatever this man has told you, save it," Fletcher cut in. "We have your brother Matthew in custody. He's already confessed." Thomas's confidence crumbled visibly. "Matthew wouldn't." "He did." Catherine's voice was cold. "He came to El Dorado Canyon looking for you, or rather, for the money. When he couldn't find it, he became desperate." Thomas's gaze darted between them. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "No," Catherine agreed. "You were supposed to disappear with the money, and I was supposed to spend the rest of my life waiting." She leaned forward. "Only one of those things happened, Thomas." For a moment, genuine regret flickered in his eyes. "I did care for you, Catherine, in my way." "Your way wasn't enough." The saloon had grown quiet, other patrons sensing drama. "Stand up slowly," Fletcher ordered. "Keep your hands visible." Thomas complied, seeming resigned. "At least allow me the dignity of walking out of here without handcuffs. I give you my word." "Your word doesn't carry much weight, Daniels," Fletcher said flatly. "But since we're in public, I'll grant you that much. Just remember, I won't hesitate to use force if you make any sudden moves." They had almost reached the exit when Thomas made his play. He shoved a bystander into Fletcher's path and bolted for the back door. "Thomas, stop!" Catherine called, but he was already gone. Fletcher recovered quickly. "Stay here." But Catherine followed anyway. She wasn't about to let Thomas escape. Not after coming all this way. Not after everything. The back door opened onto an alley. In the fading twilight, Catherine saw Thomas running toward a residential area, Fletcher in pursuit. Without thinking, she gathered her skirts and ran after them. They were heading toward a larger house set apart from its neighbors. Thomas's house, Catherine realized. She reached the porch just as Fletcher disappeared through the front door. From inside came sounds of struggle, breaking furniture, raised voices. Catherine hesitated only a heartbeat before entering. She found them in what appeared to be a study. Thomas had armed himself with a fireplace poker, swinging it wildly at Fletcher. "Catherine, help me," Thomas pleaded when he saw her. "He's trying to kill me." Put down the poker, Thomas, she said steadily. No one wants to kill you. You don't understand. I can't go back to Nevada. I can't face prison. I did it all for us, Catherine, he cried, swinging the poker again. Everything was for our future. The words, so patently false, ignited Catherine's long-suppressed rage. There was never any us, Thomas, she said, her voice rising. There was only you, using me as a convenient fiction while you committed your crimes and lived your real life far away. Thomas faltered. Her words seemed to hit him harder than any physical blow. In that moment of distraction, Fletcher struck. He grabbed Thomas's wrist, twisted sharply. The poker clattered to the floor. Fletcher drove Thomas against the wall and snapped handcuffs on his wrists. Thomas Daniels, you're under arrest, and this time you're not going anywhere. Catherine's eyes fell on the desk nearby, an open strongbox, its contents spilled across the polished surface. Gold coins, banknotes. Adam, she said quietly, nodding toward the desk. Fletcher followed her gaze, his eyes widening. Well, well, seems Mr. Daniels hasn't spent all his ill-gotten gains after all. Thomas sagged against the wall, defeated. It's not all of it, just emergency funds. And where's the rest? Thomas glanced at Catherine, then looked away. There is no rest. I spent it on this house, on clothes, on living the life I deserved. You mean the life you stole, Catherine corrected. As Fletcher gathered the money, Catherine noticed something on the desk, a framed photograph, partially covered by scattered papers. She pulled it closer and felt her breath catch. It showed Thomas standing proudly in front of this very house, his arm around the waist of a smiling young woman Catherine had never seen before. The betrayal cut deeper than anything that had come before. Not only had Thomas abandoned her, he'd replaced her, created a new life with someone else while she kept her faithful vigil. Catherine set the photograph down carefully and walked out of the study, out of the house, into the evening air. Behind her, she heard Fletcher taking Thomas into custody, heard the defeated man's empty justifications. But Catherine was done listening. The woman who'd waited on that porch was gone forever, and in her place stood someone new, someone who refused to be defined by another person's lies, someone who was ready to write her own story. But first, she had to get Thomas Daniels back to Nevada, and she had to decide what Adam Fletcher meant to her, if anything. Because he'd lied too, hadn't he? About being a prospector, about his reasons for coming to El Dorado Canyon. Trust, Catherine was learning, was the hardest thing to rebuild, even when you desperately wanted to. The journey back to Nevada was silent and tense. Thomas, handcuffed and resigned, spoke little. Fletcher remained professionally courteous, but distant, giving Catherine space to process everything. And Catherine, she spent most of the trip staring out the stagecoach window, watching the landscape roll past, wondering who she was now that her entire identity had been stripped away. On their final night before reaching Carson City, Fletcher found her sitting on the porch of a roadside inn, watching stars emerge in the deepening twilight. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the chair beside her. Catherine nodded. They sat in silence for a moment before Fletcher spoke. "What will you do when we return to El Dorado Canyon?" "I don't know," Catherine admitted. "Continue with my sewing, I suppose. Tend my garden. But differently this time. Not as ways to pass the time until something better comes along, but as a life in itself." "It's a good life," Fletcher agreed. "Honest work, a home of your own." "Yes." Catherine turned to look at him directly. "But what about you, Adam? After Thomas's trial, what then?" "Back to my duties. There are always more fugitives to track." He smiled slightly. "Though I admit, this case has been different." "Because you were personally affected?" "That's part of it." Adam hesitated. But mostly because of you, Catherine. The simple statement hung between them. I've never met anyone quite like you, Adam continued softly. Your strength, your dignity, even in the face of such betrayal. The way you've confronted the truth without flinching. I've had enough of lies, Catherine said. Even comforting ones, I might tell myself. Yes, that's exactly what I mean. They sat in companionable silence before Adam spoke again. I'll be returning to El Dorado Canyon with you, to give testimony at Thomas's trial. I expect I'll be there for at least a few weeks. Catherine's heart quickened. I see. I was thinking I might need a place to stay. The boarding house is comfortable, But, Catherine prompted. Adam turned to face her fully. But I find myself reluctant to be too far from a certain porch and the remarkable woman who no longer waits upon it. Catherine caught her breath. I'm not Thomas, Adam said quickly. I'm not asking for promises or commitments, just time. Time to see if what I've begun to feel for you might be something you could one day return. The sincerity in his voice moved Catherine deeply. Here was no smooth-talking confidence man, but someone offering honest work and genuine feeling, someone who'd proven his integrity through action. The house does have a spare room, Catherine said slowly, currently used for storage, but it could be cleared out. Adam's smile was like dawn breaking. Very practical. I do believe Mrs. Powell would find less to gossip about if you were staying as a proper boarder rather than calling on me every day. Very sensible, Adam agreed, his eyes alight. You should know, Catherine said, her voice softening, that I'm not looking for another man to wait for. If this becomes something more, it would have to be a partnership, equal and honest. I would expect nothing less, Adam assured her, taking her hand gently. In fact, I'd insist upon it. They sat hand in hand as stars wheeled overhead, the future stretching before them blank but full of possibility. 6 months later, Catherine stood on her newly expanded porch, no longer a place of waiting, but a gathering spot for living, watching the familiar dust devils dance down El Dorado Canyon's main street. Thomas and Matthew Daniels had both been sentenced to substantial prison terms. Nearly half the stolen money had been recovered and returned to victims. Adam had promptly reinvested his recovered $500 in improvements to Catherine's home. The spare room now served as his office during the periods when he wasn't traveling for Marshal duties. A new barn housed his horse and the milk cow Catherine had always wanted. And the porch where she'd spent so many hours waiting now wrapped around two sides of the house, with comfortable chairs placed to catch morning and evening light. Catherine heard hoofbeats approaching and felt her heart quicken, not with desperate longing, but with healthy anticipation of the man she'd chosen to build a life with. Adam appeared around the bend, riding tall and easy, his face breaking into a wide smile when he saw her. Right on time, she called. Supper's nearly ready. Unlike Thomas, who'd always lingered at the gate with promises to return, Adam came directly to her, closing the distance as if drawn by invisible force. I missed you, he said simply, taking her hands. You were only gone 3 days. 3 days too long. Adam raised her hand to his lips. But I bring good news. The judge approved my request for a month's leave starting next week. Catherine felt her smile bloom. Plenty of time for a honeymoon. If a certain lady is still amenable to becoming Mrs. Fletcher. Their engagement had been brief by most standards, just 2 months. But after nearly 3 years of waiting for a man who'd never intended to return, Catherine had no desire to delay happiness when it was finally within reach. The lady is very amenable, she assured him, stepping closer. In fact, she's been counting the days. Adam wrapped his arms around her waist. No more waiting on porches, Catherine. From now on, we walk forward together. I like the sound of that, Catherine whispered. As his lips met hers in a kiss full of promise, Catherine knew with absolute certainty that her waiting days were done forever. The woman who'd stood faithfully on this porch for nearly 3 years, scanning the horizon for a man who never came, had finally found what she truly deserved, not in patient endurance, but in the courage to step off the porch and into a future of her own making. And beside her, every step of the way, would be the man who kept his word. The man who said, "I'll be the one who comes back." And did. 5 years later, the Fletcher porch was no longer a place of waiting, but a place of joyful reunion. Catherine sat in a rocking chair, cradling 1-month-old Elizabeth, while 3-year-old Thomas, named for Adam's grandfather, not the man who'd deceived her, played with wooden blocks at her feet. A wagon approached, and 5-year-old James scrambled down, eager to share his Marshal business adventures with his mother. "Careful, son," Adam cautioned, following at a measured pace. "Mama, Papa let me help deliver papers to Judge Wilson, and we saw a real outlaw." Catherine raised an eyebrow at Adam, who grinned. "A very reformed outlaw. Old Jake Winters, who served his time and now sweeps the bank steps." As the boys became absorbed in play, Adam settled into the rocker beside Catherine, his gaze taking in the domestic scene with evident satisfaction. "You ever think about him?" Adam asked quietly, his voice pitched so the children couldn't hear. Catherine knew who he meant. Sometimes, not with regret, but with a kind of gratitude. Gratitude. Not for him exactly, but for the path that led from him to you, to this. She glanced at Elizabeth, then at the boys, then at her husband. "If I hadn't spent those years waiting on this porch, I might never have been here when you arrived." Adam reached across to take her free hand. "I'd like to think we would have found each other anyway. Some things are meant to be. Well, I'm grateful anyway, for every step that brought us here." As the sun began to set over El Dorado Canyon, casting long shadows across the land, the Fletcher family remained on their porch, not waiting, but simply being together. The woman who'd once stood vigil for a man who never returned had found something far more precious, a man who always came home, and a life built on trust rather than empty promises. The porch was no longer a place of solitary waiting, but a gathering spot for a family bound by love and truth. And as Catherine looked at the faces of her husband and children, she knew she wouldn't change a single step of the journey that had led her here. For on this porch, the waiting had ended, and the living, the real living, had finally begun. If you enjoyed Catherine's journey from heartbreak to hope, from waiting to living, from lies to truth, hit that subscribe button. Because everyone deserves a story where the waiting ends and the real life begins. Don't let this be the last chapter you read with us. Subscribe now, and let's discover more stories of courage, redemption, and second chances together. Your next great story is just a click away.